116 years. 5 generations of kings. Millions of lives lost in the mud of France. This wasn't just a war, it was a century-long funeral for the Middle Ages. From the slaughter at Sluis to the fires of Agincourt, 2 nations fought until there was nothing left but bone and banners. This is the story of how a stolen crown set the world on fire. This is the 100 Years' War. It started with an empty chair. In 1328, the great House of Capet, the kings who had ruled France for 300 years, simply ran out of sons. King Charles IV died, and the golden crown of France was left sitting on a velvet cushion with no head to wear it. Across the English Channel, a teenage King Edward III was watching. He wasn't just a neighbor. He was the nephew of the dead king. By the laws of blood and birth, the throne was his. But the French nobility was terrified. They looked at the map and saw a nightmare, an English king sitting in Paris. They couldn't allow it. They dug through dusty basements and old scrolls until they found a loophole. The Salic Law. An ancient, forgotten code from the time of tribal warlords. It said that a woman could not inherit the throne, and more importantly, she could not pass the right to her son. With a stroke of a pen, they erased Edward's mother, Isabella, and they erased Edward. They chose a Frenchman instead. Philip of Valois. They thought they had outsmarted the boy in London. They thought the English would grumble and then go back to their sheep and their wool. They didn't realize they had just lit a fuse that would burn for a century. This was more than a legal dispute. This was a direct insult to the blood of the Plantagenets. Edward was young, aggressive, and surrounded by advisors who whispered that France was his by divine right. The tension was a powder keg waiting for a spark. And that spark was about to come from the heavy hand of the new French king. She-Wolf's revenge, Edward wasn't just any king. He was the son of Isabella, known to history as the She-Wolf of France. She was a woman who had hunted down her own husband and ruled England with an iron fist. She had raised her son to be a predator. When the French King Philip tried to humiliate Edward by seizing his lands in Aquitaine, the English boy didn't cry. He didn't beg. He stood up in front of his court and did the unthinkable. He didn't just ask for his land back. He claimed the whole kingdom. He sewed the French fleur-de-lis onto his own royal surcoat. It was the ultimate middle finger to the French elite. Philip called Edward a rebellious servant. Edward called Philip a thief and a usurper. The diplomats went home. The blacksmiths went to work. The most powerful kingdom in Europe was about to face a nightmare it never saw coming. This was a declaration of total war. Edward was betting his entire kingdom, his treasury, and his life on a single claim. He borrowed massive sums of money from Italian bankers, mortgaging the future of England for a chance at the greatest prize in Christendom. The ships were gathered. The spears were sharpened. The English were coming. Scene 3, the wooden wall at Sluis, 1340. The war moves to the water. Philip knew Edward had to cross the sea to reach him. So, he built a wall. At the port of Sluis, the French gathered a massive armada. 200 ships. 20,000 men. They were so confident that they chained their vessels together in 3 massive lines. They turned the harbor into a floating fortress of oak and iron. Edward arrived with the morning sun. His advisors told him to turn back. They said the French numbers were too great. Edward looked at the wall of ships and saw a trap, not for him, but for them. He waited. He waited for the tide to turn. He waited for the sun to move behind his back, so the French defenders would have to squint against the glare. Then, he gave the signal. The trumpets of England screamed across the waves. The French commanders stood on their high decks, laughing at the smaller English fleet. They believed their chains made them invincible. They believed their heavy cogs would crush the English like eggshells. They had no idea that the rules of war had changed while they were sleeping. Scene 4, the Hurricane of Steel, the French were prepared for a sea battle. They expected boarding pikes and slow-moving cogs. What they got was a hurricane. The English longbow. This wasn't a toy. This was a 6-foot-tall machine of war made of yew wood. An archer could fire 6 to 10 arrows a minute. Thousands of archers. Tens of thousands of arrows. The grey goose-winged shafts rained down from the sky like a winter storm. The French sailors, packed onto their cramped, chained decks, had nowhere to hide. The arrows punched through boiled leather. They punched through chainmail. They blinded the men before they could even wind their heavy, slow crossbows. It was a massacre on the water. The French advantage, the chains, became their death sentence. They couldn't move. They couldn't maneuver. They were sitting ducks in a lake of fire and feathers. Imagine the terror on those decks. The sound of wood splintering, the screams of the wounded, and the relentless, rhythmic thrum of the longbows. For hours, the sky was never empty of steel. The French lines began to buckle before a single English soldier even stepped onto their ships. Scene 5, the Sea of Blood. As the English ships crashed into the French line, the naval battle turned into a street fight. English knights leaped onto the blood-slick decks. Axes swung. Hammers crushed helmets. In the tight spaces between the masts, there was no room for the rules of war. It was brutal. It was personal. Men in full plate armor were knocked overboard. They didn't float. They sank like stones, disappearing into the dark, cold depths of the channel. By sunset, the harbor of Sluis was a graveyard of broken wood and floating corpses. The entire French navy, the largest in the Western world, was gone. 20,000 Frenchmen lay dead in the bay. The joke in the French court was that the fish were finally learning to speak English because they had eaten so many French sailors. The English Channel was no longer a barrier. It was Edward's highway. The door to France was kicked wide open. The invasion had truly begun. Edward stepped onto the shores of France not as a visitor, but as a conqueror. The victory at Sluis had secured the waves, but the land was a different story. Philip still held the cities, the castles, and the gold. The struggle for the crown was no longer a matter of law. It was a matter of fire. 1346, Edward III finally lands his boots on the soil of Normandy. He isn't looking for a fair fight. He is looking to break the spirit of France. This is the Chivorci. A campaign of fire and terror. The English army moves like a wall of smoke. They aren't capturing castles, they are burning every farm and every village in their path. For Edward, this is a message. He is proving that King Philip cannot protect his own people. If Philip won't fight, he isn't a king. But the French giant is finally waking up. Philip gathers the greatest assembly of knights in history. Thousands of men in gleaming plate armor. They trap Edward near a ridge by the forest of Crécy. The English are tired, hungry, and outnumbered 3-1. The French believe that the English boy has finally run out of luck. August 26th. A sudden thunderstorm turns the field into a swamp. The French send in their secret weapon, the Genoese crossbowmen. But the rain has soaked their strings. They are useless. Opposite them, the English longbowmen stand silent. They kept their strings dry under their hats. The Genoese move forward, shouting. They fire their wet bolts. They fall short. Then, the English step forward. One motion. 6,000 men. The longbow is pulled to the ear. And then, they unleash. It looks like snow. A wall of white-feathered death blotting out the sun. This is the Thyern rain. The Genoese are shredded in seconds. They turn to flee, but the French knights are disgusted. They spur their horses and gallop straight through their own men. It is a disaster of pride. The heavy horses sink into the mud. The longbowmen don't stop. They aim for the horses. A knight is invincible on a horse, but on the ground, he is a turtle on its back. By nightfall, the flower of French chivalry is dead in the dirt. 1,500 lords and knights. 10,000 soldiers. Edward has won the impossible. But as the English celebrate, a new shadow is moving across the map. It doesn't care about crowns. It doesn't care about claims. 1348. The Black Death. The great mortality hits Europe like a hammer. The war stops because there is no one left to fight. 1/3 of the continent is wiped out. Families are buried in mass pits. The 100 Years' War is forced into a silence of ghosts. But the survivors? They haven't learned a thing. When the plague fades, the fire will return. And it will be led by a prince dressed in black. As the Black Death finally recedes from the scorched plains of Europe, a new shadow emerges from the smoke. Edward, the Prince of Wales. History will remember him by a darker, more terrifying name. The Black Prince. He is young. He is athletic. And he is the most dangerous man of his age. Unlike his father, who fought for a crown, the Black Prince fights for the hunt. In 1355, he leads a new kind of campaign. A strike so fast and so deep that the French cannot even find him. He lands in Bordeaux and carves a path of total destruction through the heart of southern France. He isn't holding territory. He is looting it. Hundreds of wagons follow his army, overflowing with gold, silk, and the pride of French noble houses. He is a ghost in black steel, moving through the countryside like a forest fire. But in 1356, his luck seems to run out. King John II of France has finally trapped the predator. Near the city of Poitiers, the French army blocks the path. The English are cornered. They are exhausted. They are heavily outnumbered. King John looks at the small English force and smiles. He believes he is about to end the war in a single afternoon. September 19th. 1356. The morning air is cold. The Black Prince positions his men behind a thick hedge, protected by a narrow lane. It is a natural bottleneck. A death trap. King John is determined not to repeat the mistakes of Crécy. He orders his elite knights to dismount. He wants them to fight on foot, man to man, steel to steel. He believes the English longbow will be useless against heavily armored men moving slowly and steadily. The French advance is a wall of iron. Thousands of knights, shields held high, marching toward the English line. The ground shakes under their weight. The Black Prince watches them come. He doesn't move. He doesn't speak. Then, he gives the order. Not to the archers, but to his cavalry. A small group of English knights circles around the back of the French army. It is a gamble. If it fails, the prince is dead. If it works, the world changes. The battle turns into a chaotic meat grinder. The narrow lane becomes a river of blood. The English longbowmen, seeing the French knights closing in, drop their bows. They pick up hammers. They pick up axes. They dive into the gaps in the French armor like wolves. Suddenly, the English cavalry hits the French from the rear. Panic ripples through the lines. The French invincible army begins to shatter. In the center of the storm, King John II is fighting for his life. He is surrounded by his youngest son, Philip, who screams, "Father, guard to the right! Father, guard to the left!" But it is too late. A French knight fighting for the English pushes through the crowd. He screams, "Sire, surrender!" King John drops his axe. The King of France, the most powerful man in Christendom, is now a prisoner of war. The news hits Europe like a lightning bolt. A king has been captured on the field of battle. The French army is destroyed. Their leader is in an English cage. France doesn't just lose a battle, it loses its mind. France collapses. With their king in London, the country falls into anarchy. The peasants, tired of being burned and taxed, rise up in a bloody revolution called the Jacquerie. They hunt down the nobles who failed to protect them. Paris becomes a war zone. Meanwhile, in London, King John is treated like a guest of honor. He goes hunting. He attends banquets. But the price of his freedom is staggering. Edward III demands a ransom of 3 million gold crowns. An amount so massive it would take every coin in France to pay it. In 1360, the Treaty of Brilliance is signed. Edward wins. He takes a full third of France for himself. He is no longer just a king of a small island. He is the master of Western Europe. The Black Prince is at the height of his glory. The English longbow is the most feared weapon on earth. The first great phase of the 100 Years' War is over. England is triumphant. France is a broken, bleeding ruin. But victory is a fleeting ghost. The Black Prince, the man who couldn't be killed in battle, is struck down by a slow, wasting disease. Edward III grows old and senile, losing his grip on the empire he built. The French are down, but they are not dead. A new generation is watching. A new generation is learning. They are waiting for the English to grow tired. They are waiting for a miracle. The fires of 1337 are still burning. The century of death has only just begun. The crown is still up for grabs. And the next chapter will be written in fire and voices from heaven. This was only the beginning.